So I'm already letting us run late, but I do think there's some point to the discussion that we're having. First of all, my apologies for being late to our next speaker, who is Jitendra Malik, Arthur J. Chick Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at UC Berkeley. He received the B.Tech degree in electrical engineering from IIT Kanpur in 1980 and the PhD in computer science from Stanford in 1985. He joined the faculty at University of California at the same time as I did, and we as young faculty members years ago had many opportunities to have coffee together at Café Nefeli on Euclid Avenue, which unfortunately closed down just several weeks ago and led to a cry of pain across the entire email chain that was inspired by that event. He's currently the Arthur J. Chick Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at Berkeley. He's also in the Department of Bioengineering and in the Cognitive Science and Vision groups. He's been chair of the Computer Science Division. He's been department chair of EECS. His research group has worked on many different topics in computer vision, computational modeling of human vision, computer graphics, and the analysis of biological images. Several well-known concepts and algorithms arose in his research, such as anisotropic diffusion, normalized cuts, high dynamic range imaging, shape context, and RCNN. He's mentored more than 60 PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. He's received a number of research awards, which include 5 Test of Time awards at vision research conferences, including twice at CVPR, where he's won the Longuet-Higgins Prize, the Helmholtz Prize at ICCV. He's received IEEE PMI Distinguished Researcher in Computer Vision Awards, the K.S. Fu Prize from the International Association of Pattern Recognition, the Alan Newell Prize from ACM AAAI, and the IGCAI Award for Research Excellence in AI. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Jitendra Malik.
Thank you, David, for this warm introduction. So I should mention that currently, in addition to being at Berkeley, I'm also at Facebook AI Research, and perhaps this is connected to the issues about the commercialization of AI, machine learning, deep learning, and so on. So let's start. So I like to start with this slide because it sets the context a little bit for what the field of AI is about. I don't know what the field of AI is. I think I know what intelligence is, and intelligence is best thought of as a biological process, starting off maybe 500 million years ago with the emergence of the first animals which could move and which could see. I'm a vision chauvinist, so I'm going to, there is this book which says that in fact the Cambrian explosion, the most important part was the development of vision systems. Because once you had vision systems and you could move, then you had an advantage. You could go to various places and find food. And if you couldn't move, you wouldn't have that advantage. And then that set off an arms race where some animals developed better vision systems, others developed camouflage. If you are going to move to catch prey, then the other animal is going to try to escape, etc., etc. So anyway, so there's a slogan, we see in order to move and we move in order to see. Then let's move to more recent times, the hominid line, 5 million years. And this is the period of the development of the hand manipulation system. There is quite a bit of evidence that, in fact, the development of the hand that drove the development of the brain, I mean, brain size doubling, I mean, this was probably a significant factor. And then when we come to what we regard, what the common person in the street regards as intelligence, that's really much more recent, last 50,000 years, language, symbolic reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, so most of the time, most of evolutionary time, intelligence is really about perception and action. So if we think of this order, it starts with vision and locomotion, then manipulation, and then language. And successes in AI seem to follow the same order. So vision and locomotion, well, we heard from Amnon Shashua, the success of his company is essentially about combining vision and locomotion. Manipulation, I think I don't believe that we have solved this. Just look at the parallel jaw gripper that roboticists use and the human hand. It's degrees of freedom, the control, the haptics, the touch, sense of touch, etc., etc. I think we are a long way away from claiming anything close to human capabilities in navigation. In language, we are perhaps even further behind. Okay. So now the successes of deep learning are, I think, these four. These are the ones which have attracted the most attention: computer vision, speech understanding, machine translation, and game playing. Of these, the first three have big commercial value. Game playing is what gets you in the popular press, right? Success at winning Go, etc. But there isn't really any money to be made of it, or maybe there is some. But computer vision, speech understanding, machine translation. My talk is going to be focused largely on computer vision. Notice that these are all, yes, they're all examples of narrow AI. In speech understanding and machine translation, we are hitting at questions of language. But this is not my talk, but I think the techniques that are used, they are a very far cry from what's going on in sort of human processes. It's sort of more akin to what I would call the Chinese room kind of process, where symbols coming in, symbols going out based on sort of statistical regularities. Nevertheless, it is very, very useful. I mean, for Google or Facebook, the ability to translate text comments from one language to another is of great practical use. So, however, my talk is going to be about computer vision. Okay, now what's been responsible for all these AI successes? So everybody knows that it's about big computing and big data, but it's not just that. It's also big annotation and big simulation. We would not have had success with just big computing and big data if it wasn't for the fact that you could label thousands or millions of, or billions of, at least millions of images using Amazon Mechanical Turk. Without that kind of supervisory signal, we would not have gone a long way. Big simulation, I think this example makes it very clear. I mean, we all know about the success of Go. Well, the reason why these programs were successful is because this is a game where it's not a stochastic game. You are able to simulate this. You have complete information. And therefore, you can do billions of trials from which the program can learn by self-play. I mean, that original idea of learning by self-play actually goes back to 1958. Arthur Samuel showed learning in checkers with going way far back. But obviously, the computing today is much more than what was available then. I would argue that even though there is this big sort of excitement because of that, it really doesn't tell us anything whatsoever about advances in real AI. I mean, generally, we have had success in games back in the 90s as well, when chess was conquered and backgammon before that, and it really did not imply any major advances in artificial intelligence, rather advances in computer systems. There are many aspects of natural intelligence which are very different from games playing settings, so I would very much urge not to be seduced by that. My slogan for this is there's a difference between AGI, artificial gamer intelligence, and AGI, artificial general intelligence, and the two should not be mixed up. Okay, I want to talk about computing power, and this is a slide from actually 20 years ago. So since science is about prediction, I think we should acknowledge people who make good predictions. So Hans Moravec, who one of his big themes was that the important problems in AI are really the early, what a child knows by age 2 or 3. So vision, action, language, basics of language. And he had this chart talking about the kind of computing power available for various programs. And what he did was he did some back of the envelope kind of calculations of the computing power available in the human brain and comparing it to the computers of the day. And you can debate these. These are, I mean, you could argue that a single neuron can do much more fancy computations, but suppose we don't get into those debates. Essentially, you get a story which is kind of interesting, which is that if you have 100 nodes, then by that projection in 2015, you would have a power equivalent to the human brain. And this is about the time when this whole deep learning revolution has hit us. So I'm not saying that the availability of computing power is a sufficient condition, but it is certainly a necessary condition for this. And here's a chart which Moravec's book from like 20 years ago, he had made this projection of how the computing power would be. Okay, so now I'll take a few minutes to situate the current excitement about deep learning in the context of history. Okay, those who do not know the past are condemned to repeat it. So, McCulloch-Pitts, this is the first model of a neuron. This is 1943. Hebbian learning, there's a way to, this is, I think this is in his book, which is 48 or something like that. Norbert Wiener, cybernetics, this is 1950. So I'm talking, these are all references from around 1950. Like post-World War II kind of era. And there is the famous Turing paper, but I'm going to use the one which proposed the Turing test, which is 1950, but I'm actually using this paper as a reference for something else. Everybody quotes this paper, but they never read the paper, and they certainly don't read it to the end, because at the end, Turing had a proposal for how to do this, which is essentially about a sort of a learning or child development paradigm. I'm going to show it in this picture. So this kind of series of stages by which children interact with the world, and then after that they interact using language. So there's this line which is, instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? And then he has essentially a proposal along these lines. So my point is that even in 1950, there were a range of ideas about how and interest in mechanizing artificial intelligence. And if you move to 1960s, you have actually already three quite clearly different paradigms that they had split off. There's classic AI, focusing much more on logic and knowledge representation. There is pattern recognition, which with Rosenblatt, Widrow, etc. In fact, there's a longer tradition in statistics. I mean, Fisher had papers on pattern classification. And then estimation and control, Bellman, Kalman, etc. And each of these paradigms had their hopes about how successful they would be in achieving AI. And there was hype present in all of them. I have this slide, which is a New York Times article from 1958. It says, with due apologies to any representatives of ONR who might be here, new Navy device learns by doing. So basically, Rosenblatt had shown that they could distinguish between vertical lines and horizontal lines with a certain unit. And then, however, he said, okay, so the brain, blah, 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 but then it says, later perceptrons will be able to recognize people and call out their names and instantly translate speech in one language or writing to another language it was predicted. And then Mr. Rosenblatt said, in principle, it would be possible to build brains that could reproduce themselves on an assembly line and which would be conscious of their existence. So I don't know whether he said it or the reporter made things up, but it's pretty grand if all you've been able to do is to separate horizontal lines from vertical lines. Okay. Let's move on. So, what am I doing? I'm trying to exert just a little bit of filter and care here. Now I will go down the path which has led to great success in computer vision. And for this, really the starting point is Hubel and Wiesel's work in neuroscience, about 1960 actually, who discovered these cells first in cat and later in monkey of neurons which responded to orientation. Simple cells and complex cells, so those are shown. So the cell had to be, the stimulus had to be a line at a particular orientation. If you rotated it, it no longer fired so much. It had to be at the right place. If it was a simple cell, complex cells would tolerate some positional shift. And you could model these receptive fields as doing some kind of a linear combination of inputs. And this idea led to neural network architectures. So this is a paper by Fukushima in 1980. And he called it the neocognitron. But he more or less took the ideas which were around in the neuroscience community and formalized them a bit. And he had these alternating layers. Notice that in the title of the paper is unaffected by shift in position. So once you say unaffected by shift in position, that implies convolution. So you would have filters, so doing convolution, and you would have multiple ones of them. And then he had alternate layers of simple cells and complex cells. So the complex cells would do pooling, right? So some kind of averaging over pooling in some form, could be averaging, max, whatever. And then you just had layers of this, and at the highest stages you were doing some kind of pattern classification. So in fact, his examples were digits. Okay, and it didn't work very well because he was trying to be really biologically plausible. So he wanted to use Hebbian learning. So we move along a bit, and now we have the decade of the 80s, which is sort of the second big coming of neural networks. And in particular, that's the era when backpropagation was reinvented and widely known. And Jan LeCun's work, Lennet this is the Lennet architecture which Jan used for digit classification. And the key difference here is that in addition to the neocognitron architecture, there was the idea of training using backpropagation. And here there was a step made, which was a forward step was made by ignoring details of the biology, basically. So instead of worrying about is backpropagation biologically plausible, they just moved ahead and did it anyway. It was a way to do, essentially stochastic gradient descent became the leading technique. And that's 1989. And so what's happened so this was, at that point, it was not called deep learning, it was called neural networks. And then deep learning is the rebranding of that in the early to mid 2000s. And because people were already using neural networks of multiple layers, right? So the big changes are the availability of lots of training data, the ability to train networks which are much deeper, and then there are a few more tricks, but I won't have time to get into that. And that's what led to the so-called ImageNet moment, which is this 2012 publication from Hinton's group, where on the classic task of ImageNet classification, they showed that performance was clearly better than computer vision techniques. Okay, so I'm just going to go along a little bit on what happened after that in the computer vision literature, and in particular, some work from my group and actually also from Microsoft and Facebook, which sort of really cracked this problem of object detection. So the basic problem that we were trying to tackle was that we need to detect and localize objects. So you need to say that in this image there is a person and there's a horse, and you need to mark the locations of the person and the horse. So a neural network can presumably give you nice features, but how do you do that? And so this line of work called RCNN, which is regions with convolutional neural nets, the first paper in that series is the one cited here, where the basic idea was that you have some bottom-up candidates of places which might contain objects. Then you compute, you take those pixels and you run them through a convolutional neural network, and at the highest layer you're going to have a new set of features from which a linear classifier will be able to say, is this a horse or is this a person? And so what this, so then there were other variations which emerged. So there is so-called fast RCN, where even the proposals for locations where objects might be was generated by a neural network. And then there is something called mask RCNN. So I'm going to skip the details. But this is the output of the mask RCNN system. So this is from Facebook AI Research in 2017. And these are the results. Now, this is, I think, the thing which should make people notice. Because I've been in the field for a while. If someone in 2012 had told me that in 5 years from now, we will have results of this quality, I would have said, no way. I would have taken a bet with anybody saying that this is not possible. We will not get results of this type. So this is I regard as one of those impressive findings. I don't think there is anything theoretically deep about it. We don't know why it works. As far as I'm concerned, I regard the theory of this as not settled at all. But empirically, this was something to sit up and notice, and we all did. Okay, so these are some more results. And then here's a slide from Ross Kershik, who was involved in many of these stages. So basically the numbers, so we have these standard data sets on which we evaluate. So DPM, this is a pre-deep learning technique where the performance was 5% in some sense. And then it went up from 15 all the way to 46 with a couple of tricks. So some innovations in architecture, just in the design of the system, as well as if you see on the x-axis, you see names of different neural networks, AlexNet, VGG, ResNet 50, R101. And again, the finding here was deeper is better. And these networks are very deep, and in fact, in a sense that they are no longer, the biological plausibility is out of the window. Because if you consider the number of layers from retina to IT, we are talking about like 7 synapses. And we are talking in these networks about 101 layers. So it's clearly not, I think the biological inspiration has been left far behind. Let's not push that too much. And one part of the story was just sort of the vision part, how to, you're using your knowledge of computer vision, that you organize the computation according to regions. And the other part of it is what's nowadays referred to as the backbone neural network, where generally speaking, the finding is deeper is better. Though by now, I think it's sort of leveled off a bit. So 1998 Linnet, Jan LeCun's original network, AlexNet, which was what caused this revolution, VGG from Oxford, GoogleNet, ResNet, this is from Kai-Ming-He, and so on. And I want to say one thing, which is that all the part of the philosophy of deep learning is that we don't want to design features. Hand design of features is bad. Okay, yes, we have thrown that out, but instead we have replaced hand design of architectures. So we are still hacking around, it's just in a different space. I mean, we should again acknowledge that. Okay. Now, computer vision is not just recognition, and I don't know how much time I have. I want to use the remaining 5-10 minutes to talk about some other problems, and the big picture. Yeah, I have 10 minutes, great, that's good. The main point I will want to convey is that deep learning is just a function approximation technique, and you can skillfully use it with all the rest of the things you know. So in computer vision, we know some things about geometry and dynamics and physics and so forth, and those should be combined. This should be just viewed as another tool in the armamentarium. This does not replace everything else. Don't throw away everything else you knew. Combine it, okay? So let me give you some examples of that. And I'll focus on the problem of 3D, because obviously when we perceive the world, we don't, this kind of pattern labeling is part of the answer, but not the full story. We want to be able to, for example, when I look at this environment, I can judge that there are different objects, they are at certain distances, they have certain shapes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a classic problem in computer vision. It has been around, and in fact, precedes computer vision, photogrammetry, et cetera, et cetera. And there are many of the ideas. They have at their core the principle of triangulation, which was known to the Greeks, right? So you have some point in space, and you have rays from that, which are captured at 2 different locations. And if you back project those rays where they hit in space, that's going to be the location of the point, right? You can put some embroider this in various ways, but the core idea is as simple as that. And how do we take ideas like that with our newfangled tool of function approximation, which is multi-layer neural network, and how do we make these two talk, right? Because what's our goal? Our goal is an understanding of the world in front of us. And I'll take here's one piece of work which is trying to do this. So we have this bird, but when I look at this bird, I see it in 3D. But what enables me to see it in 3D? It's not stereopsis. The bird is so far away that there's not much of a disparity signal. It's really knowledge of that category. I have seen other birds before. I've seen thousands of birds before. But interestingly, this is a different problem than the usual stereo problem. Usual stereo problem, you have one object and you get multiple views. Here what you have are multiple objects, each one of which you get only a single view. And somehow in our brain we put it together to build a 3D model of that object. So how do we do that? So let's say we have seen birds before, always from a distance. We never have access to the 3D. And so what we are able to get is that from this single image, we are able to predict its 3D shape, what's the camera viewpoint, as well as the texture. And once you have that, then you can, of course, predict what it would look like from different viewpoints. So what we need to do is essentially a way to bring into this function approximation machinery with stochastic gradient descent, otherwise known as deep learning. What we need to do is to bring in the kinds of classical constraints that the projections have to be consistent. So I have a 3D object. It should give rise to the projections in appropriate, for appropriate camera views, which are, right? So how do we do that? So the approach has to be that you take an image, you run it through an encoder, you predict the camera shape, etc. Now the loss function is going to capture that the shapes are right, the key points are at the right place, etc., etc. So this is putting it into a sort of optimization or in this framework, the kinds of constraints which we knew about from classical computer vision. And we also need some priors, so priors don't go away, and priors here are like smoothness, so you can minimize the mean curvature, symmetry, etc. And then we can build reconstructions like this. Okay, this is the kind of thing which could not have been done just using learning techniques alone or just using classical geometry alone. It really required the combination of the two. We can use these ideas for inferring shapes of humans. So humans, there'll be shape. There are fat people, thin people, etc. There's pose. So this is a non-rigid recovery problem. And we don't have paired 2D, 3D data, or not much of it anyway. But the idea is that we are trying to explain the 2D with distributions from the 3D. Again, I'm skipping details, but the philosophy is probably what I showed you earlier. This is just something which shows the end results, that we can reconstruct humans pretty accurately. More recent work shows that we can, in fact, estimate dynamics quite well as well. So we can do predictions. So we can run time forward and see if we have seen the person moving so far like so, what will be the future. Other classical problems. So this is again an interesting question, which is how do we see 3D? For humans, it's a combination of multiple cues. So when there's a chair in the back of the room, I see it as a 3D shape. How do I see it as a 3D shape? It is not based at all on. It is not at all based on stereopsis or structure from motion, because at that distance the disparity is not there. It is based on remembrance of things past, basically. I have been near previous chairs and I hallucinated. So it is controlled hallucination going on. And now that, however, as I approach the chair, that changes. I move from that controlled hallucination to signal derived from my measurements. As I approach it, I actually get a direct signal. And we have a system which somehow does that in a sort of unified way. Whereas classically in computer vision, we had shape from X techniques, which would try to use stereo, and then there would be techniques which are based on models, and they were all, we just had this zoo of different techniques. Deep learning has enabled us to unify them in a very clean way. It's a good mechanism for integrating a variety of these signals. And when we design architectures for doing this, we in fact make use of a lot of our classical techniques. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to, I'll skip details, but this is like your classic photo consistency constraint. There's like a classic stereo pipeline, but we can now train it end to end. And I'll use 2 minutes to talk about how we use vision for action. So, for example, navigation. This is the most important ability for 500 million years for animals was to move, and we see in order to move, we move in order to see. And animals can make use of landmark-based navigation as well as maps. So insects mostly make use of landmarks. They don't store very detailed maps, but by the time you come to mammals like rats and hippocampuses and so forth, you do have maps of environments. And it turns out that, so in computer vision, this would traditionally be done by reconstructing an environment in gory detail. It turns out you don't need to do that complete reconstruction. This is the classic computer vision technique. Build up an environment and then you treat it as a computational geometry problem. Instead, it turns out that you don't need to reconstruct everything. Rather, very little of the environment is needed. Just think about it. An insect, which has a brain which is very small, is able to perfectly well handle the problem of navigation. So it clearly does not require that kind of heavy horsepower. And so these are problems which are amenable to learning techniques. That's all I guess I have to say. I'll skip away. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, I want to get to okay, one slide here which I wanted to show, which is that really we can in fact combine learning techniques with control. So again, I'm not revolutionary in the sense that deep learning means that all classical stuff is gone. I think I just talked about how geometry can be combined, and now a lot of our work in robotics really combines with control theory, which has a very solid body of results and about robustness. And I'll jump to my final conclusion slide. Okay. Okay, I want to leave with this final slide on what problems are left to be solved. One is few-shot learning. We learn with, if you have like 1,000 examples of a category, these current techniques will do a good job. But that's not always going to be the case. In fact, in any practical setting, we know that there is a tail behavior, Zipf's law, right? There are versions of that. So there will be many categories for which you will have relatively few examples, 100, 10, 5, and so on. And this is where the kinds of techniques we use don't work very well. The hope is that there will be some transfer from the representations, but it's still a hope. I like this line which I first heard from Don Gehman, which is that who cares about big data? We care about small data. So Don's line is, the important case is not n going to infinity, but n going to 1. And I think that's a challenge for our field. We cannot handle the case n going to 1, and in fact, it is actually an important practical case. Second remark is that learning with little supervision, what we have is not just the success of big computing and big data, but actually big annotation. Those thousands of people sitting in cubicles all around the world, typing in cat, dog, chair, etc., etc. This is, and if you think about how children learn, clearly they do not need that extensive supervision. And so some of the work I showed you goes in that direction. The example that I gave about the learning of geometrical models of birds was one case study, where we did not need to have a supervision of the 3D shape of the object in order to predict 3D shape. We just used a variety of these consistency constraints. Unifying learning with geometric reasoning is very important. I'm focusing on computer vision. In other settings, there will be others. And finally, I think, again, perception and control, they have to be treated together, and we just have the beginnings of that. So deep learning has made significant contribution to our field. It has become certainly the kind of feature tweaking with histograms of oriented gradients and various things we used to go, all that is out of the window. We've replaced feature learning by tweaking architectures instead, which maybe is better. We have had clear empirical advances, but there's a lot to do. Thank you.
We're running into the break, but I'll still entertain two quick questions.
Tommy?
Tommy
In your historical overview, you neglected the fact that machine learning existed before deep learning in 2000. There was quite a bit done in vision.
Yes, of course. I mean, I didn't neglect it. Okay, so Tommy's question was, machine learning existed before deep learning, and the answer is obviously yes. Yeah.
Mobilize an example for 10 years.
Yeah.
Without deep learning.
No, machine learning existed before that, and statistics existed even before that. Okay. I mean, Fisher's paper on iris classification, 1936. I mean, the book Duda and Hart is 1973. So the tradition that I talked about, the second middle tradition of pattern recognition, that connected up to classical statistics as well.
Okay, just one more question, unfortunately. Please.
In traditional machine learning, I think there are some classical problems like classification, regression, metric learning. But there's another problem like clustering. I think deep learning has made a lot of progress in those supervised learning tasks like classification, regression, metric learning. But for those kind of unsupervised learning tasks like clustering, we haven't seen much progress. I think there are a little bit on that, but in general, my feeling is that the progress is not as much as in supervised learning. Is there obstacle that prevent us in adopting deep learning in the clustering problems?
No, the big gains of deep learning come, I mean, deep learning is a technique for function approximation. You need to know the input, you need to know the output, right? So that's why supervised learning is where it's most natural. In terms of clustering, there is definitely some work, and a lot of it revolves around the fact that we get intermediate representations which are very good, which may have been arrived at by supervised learning on some other task. And once you have those intermediate representations which are good, you've got a good metric in some n-dimensional space. And now if you do clustering in that metric, it is going to work better than, say, clustering in pixel space.
So we're going to have a break now, but it's going to be compressed to about 10 minutes. And let's thank again our speakers.